Let's talk about Centimorgans tonight. This is my usual full disclosure statement, and so I am able to come to you with an independent perspective. So thank you for being here with me tonight. I appreciate you being here. Appreciate your time and attention. We'll talk about Centimorgans. This is a Facebook Live presentation. It's being recorded, so it will be available later, and it'll be available on Facebook and YouTube. Please like, share, comment, subscribe. Really appreciate that. Before I get started, I got an email from Ancestry a few hours ago. I was checking my email, and as I was looking for something else, this popped up, and it said, we have a shared ancestor hint for your daughter. And it was on my side, and so the wheels were turning. I'm not sure why it didn't come up for me, but unfortunately it was a private tree. I'm not sure how that happened. 24 Centimorgans, the shared ancestor or the shared matches list didn't really provide any clarification, but apparently there's a shared ancestor in this Charles Henson, one of my ancestors. I'm not sure there's a really good lesson there, just felt that was pretty surprising to have that public tree disappear in an instant. But these are the things that we encounter. So our goal tonight is to learn to use Centimorgan values for family history research, and we'll approach this with real examples that I've encountered in my research, and I think these will be helpful examples. So for me and for many of us, I think the progression in becoming familiar with Centimorgans starts with the general interest in the ethnicity reports, which leads to discovery of the match lists of mysterious cousins, and then we start to look at the DNA details, the most prominent of which are the Centimorgan values that are reported for our matches. And we want to put this in perspective. Shared Centimorgans, total shared Centimorgans are very helpful and very important. They're referred to as genetic distance, and we use that genetic distance in combination with genetic coordinates when we can get access to that. The matching segment details can give us a lot of additional information. So ideally, we're using this information together. We're using total Centimorgans in combination with matching segment details to learn as much as possible about our matches and to explore our family history to the fullest extent. But today we're focused on Centimorgans. We just don't want to lose sight of the other side of the picture. So Centimorgans are a unit of genetic distance, and this is the distance between chromosome positions, distance between positions on chromosomes. One Centimorgan is equal approximately to 1 million base pairs on average. Base pairs, of course, are the individual letters of the genetic code. So one Centimorgan is equal to about 1 million of those letters. Greater distance means more DNA. So more Centimorgans implies a stronger biological relationship, generally speaking. And we'll get into some details. If you want to read about Centimorgans on your own and explore this topic in more depth, I certainly recommend the material that's on the International Society of Genetic Genealogy wiki pages. In particular, I recommend the page entitled Centimorgan and the page entitled Autosomal DNA Statistics. If you dive into that information, you'll know quite a bit, and there's a lot of good information there. And these pages are linked here. On this slide, you can find these links in the PDF file that I uploaded tonight for this presentation. These are some numbers that I've found to be helpful. I think they're easy to remember. These numbers are not at the exact midpoint for each of the ranges that you see for each of these relationships. So bear in mind that these are not averages or the middle of the range, but they are easy to remember, and they've served me well, and I think they are fairly representative of what we see with these relationships. So with parent-child relationships, you see about 3,500 Centimorgans. With full siblings, 2,500, grandparents, 1,700, first cousins, 1,000s, and so on. And again, you need to be familiar with the ranges and you'll get that from various tables and tools that are available. But I think if you keep these numbers in mind, it's easy to keep these simple round numbers in mind to sort things out quickly. And one other thing that I'll mention, you'll see here I've put first cousin once removed next to first cousin, and you'll see that the number for first cousin once removed is half of what you see with the first cousin relationship. So that's another way to make this information easier to remember. If you have a first cousin who shares about 1,000 centimorgans with you, you'll expect first cousin once removed that first cousin's child should share about half. And so you don't necessarily have to pull up a table or a tool to think about these relationships that way. These are very simple ways of remembering these numbers. And it works the other way around. If you have a first cousin once removed who shares about 500 centimorgans with you, that's a normal number for that relationship, and you can double that number to know what to expect with the first cousin. So just some general rules of thumb there. Finding the centimorgan values at the various DNA testing, DNA matching companies is variable because the websites are so different. At Ancestry DNA, the information for shared centimorgans, total shared centimorgans, is tucked away, and it's a little harder to find, so we'll talk about that briefly. The first step to finding that information is to click on the link for your DNA match, and then when you get to the DNA match page, you find the tiny lowercase I near the top of the page, and click on that, and you'll find what you're looking for. So we'll start off. Our first example tonight is Jack. He is a new match. He's a very accomplished and knowledgeable gentleman, so it's nice to have him as a match, and we've been working together recently. I found him on my match list, so if you click on the link to find your match list, you'll find matches of interest. In this case, we're looking for Jack. He's predicted to be in the second to third cousin range for me. So if I click on Jack, I'm taken to our match page, and you'll see there this little gray disc with the lowercase I. If you click on that, you'll find the amount of DNA that you share with your match and get more specific information. So 271 centimorgans in this case. And again, been working with Jack over the past couple of weeks, and he had no trouble at all getting onto GEDmatch so that we could find some more detailed information. And these are the matching segment details. We also see that the total centimorgans that are shared in this case are almost exactly the same as what Ancestry is reporting, so it's nice to have that line up equally. And I show this so that, again, we don't lose sight of the fact that total centimorgans, as useful as they are, it's important to get access to the full spectrum of matching segment details if you can get that. And in this case, I was able to encourage Jack to go to GEDmatch so that we could get the matching segment details, and armed with these matching segment details, we could go a lot further and find out exactly how we're related or confirm exactly how we're related. So we're going to be focused on total centimorgans tonight, but we don't want to forget the value of the matching segment details. And this is just a graphical representation of those matching segment details. So again, we share approximately 270 centimorgans. That DNA is distributed across the genome in very specific locations, and the specific location of each segment tells us something about our shared history. And so we want to remember that this is useful information that we can get access to if we transfer or if we upload files to GEDmatch and other websites. So again, we're going to look at total centimorgans tonight. And so the question in this case is, what does it mean that we share 271 centimorgans? And you can approach this different ways. There are many tables scattered across the internet and Pinterest groups and blogs and other resources. In this case, 271 centimorgans takes us to Group D and Group E on the green DNA detectives chart that you often see shared in the Facebook groups. So 271 centimorgans makes us fall into one of these two groups. So one of the possibilities for Group D is first cousin once removed, and one of the possibilities for Group E is second cousin. So these are the possibilities that 271 centimorgans brings us to, according to the green chart that we often see. We can also use a tool such as the popular shared centimorgan tool at DNA Painter. This is from Jonny Perl. This is a very popular resource for good reason. If we plug 271 centimorgans into this tool, we're told that Group E is the most probable scenario by far, a 60% chance of a match coming from this category with 271 centimorgans. So that includes the possibility of second cousins. Group F and Group D are also possible with this amount of DNA. About 20% chance of Group F, 20% chance of Group D. And the possibilities there include half second cousin or half first cousin, but those are thought to be less likely according to the information provided by DNA Painter. So what did we actually find in this case? It wasn't hard to find our shared ancestry because Jack knows his history, and although he doesn't have a tree on ancestry, he knows who his ancestors are, and my father was his second cousin. So this one was easy to sort out, but as you can see, the prediction or the actual relationship here is not quite what the green chart and Jonny Perl's tool were predicting. So an important lesson here is that DNA is passed across generations randomly, and relationship predictions based on centimorgans cannot pinpoint the distance of the relationship with absolute perfect accuracy. Real results deviate from expected averages. You can get low probability results. You can get scenarios that are essentially off the charts, so to speak. So we have to keep that in mind. In some cases, when the results deviate extremely, we have to re-examine our assumptions. But in some cases, we just have to accept the fact that we're going to see some lower probability scenarios when we look at scores, dozens, hundreds of cousins. We're going to see some low probability scenarios from time to time. So this can lead us to another lesson, and I compared Jack to multiple family members. So there you can see 286.5 for me. There's a whole range of possibilities here. I've compared Jack to all of my tested siblings, and these are all full siblings, and yet we have a big range of possibilities. The lowest number here is less than half of the biggest number, so quite a big range here. But if we take the average of these numbers, we get 175.4, and then if we take that number and go back to our green chart, we see that Group F comes into play, and there we have the second cousin once removed category of possibilities. So by looking at the average for my entire family, we got closer to the truth, and so I think there's an important lesson there. It's the same thing with Jonny Perl's tool. We put 175.4 into that tool, and then the category including second cousin once removed rises to the top of the list as the most probable explanation for the shared DNA. So what we see with an individual DNA test result pales in comparison to what we see when we compare with multiple family members, and I would certainly encourage you to test as many people as possible in your family. When I first got into genetic genealogy, I really didn't understand why there were so many people testing large numbers of family members, and now it's much more clear. So make as many comparisons as you can. That's the lesson of this example. So now we can move on to example 2, and this is a two-part example. One of these examples, we have an 83 centimorgan match, and Ancestry is predicting that this match is a fourth cousin relationship, and Ancestry is predicting this fourth cousin relationship with extremely high confidence. You can see in fine print that they're saying that there's a range. It could be anywhere in the fourth to sixth cousin range, but they're apparently extremely confident that this is a fourth cousin relationship. And then we contrast this to example 2b. This is just a 7.7 centimorgan relationship, so a much more distant relationship. This is predicted to be distant cousins with moderate confidence. That's the lowest level of confidence that Ancestry DNA reports. So a stark contrast here. And we can take a look at this from the perspective of Jonny Perl's calculator. If we put 83 centimorgans into the calculator with 2A, we get a third cousin prediction among other closely related possibilities. And with example 2B, we get a range of possibilities, including a sixth cousin, seventh cousin, and others. So all of those possibilities with example 2B are considerably more distant than the possibilities with example 2A. So then we move on and we look at what the actual relationship is in this case. This is actually the same person being compared against two full siblings. So example 2A is cousin Cheryl compared to me, and example 2B is cousin Cheryl compared to my full sister, and yet we have this huge range. Sometimes you get extreme results, and it's important to keep that in mind. So the actual relationship here is half first cousin, 3 times removed. It's the same relationship with both people. So again, relationship predictions based on centimorgans cannot pinpoint the distance of the relationship with absolute perfect accuracy. Real results deviate considerably from the average. So you really want to make a lot of comparisons so you can get a fuller, more complete picture. If my sister had been the only person in the family to test, we would have never known that Cheryl was an interesting match because it's so distant. That match is at the bottom of the pile, and we never really would have paid attention to it. So now moving on to example 3, the image here is partially obscured, but this is Thomas Mann and Elizabeth Denton. This is a match for my sister. This match also matches me, but my sister is the best match in the family, so we're focused on her in this example. And here we have a very distant relationship, seventh cousins, once removed. That's an interesting distance. You have to wonder if you can reliably detect this relationship with DNA. But we have a shared ancestor hint, so that makes it more interesting. These shared ancestor hints are fairly seductive, and they're hard to ignore if you're sorting through your match list. So let's take a look at this a little closer, and we see that this is a 94 centimorgan relationship. 94 centimorgans is a pretty good match for most people. It's a pretty good match for me. In most cases, when we share 94 centimorgans or about that much DNA, we can find a good explanation for the shared DNA. But 94 centimorgans, if you're familiar with these numbers, is a very large number for seventh cousins once removed. So you should be suspicious when you see something like this. It's not, you don't expect to share any DNA with a cousin this distant. In fact, I have a table from the ISOG wiki, and this shows the probability of sharing no DNA at all with various relationships. So you can see there at the top with first cousins, they always share DNA. So the probability of sharing no DNA with a first cousin is essentially 0. As you move down, you get down to third cousins. Some of your third cousins will share no DNA with you. You get all the way down to sixth cousin once removed. You're probably not going to share any DNA at all with people that distant. This chart is based on simulated data, and it's telling us that there's a 94% chance of sharing absolutely no DNA at all with a cousin that distant. So to share DNA and to share a good bit of DNA with a cousin this distant should really cause us to be suspicious. So plugging this number into Jonny Perl's calculator, the issue here becomes more stark. This calculator is telling us that the probability of having or seeing a seventh cousin once removed relationship with this much DNA, with 94 centimorgans of DNA, is only 0.42%. And I would say that percentage is probably generous. Even that low number is probably on the generous side. So we should really be suspicious. And in this case, we actually did find a closer relationship over about a 1.5 year period with help from my cousin Brian Smith. We were able to find a much closer relationship. And we had to break down a brick wall to find this. So it wasn't easy. That's why it took so long. It was my Smith line, and John Smith, his parents weren't known. We eventually found his parents in Enigma, Georgia, of all places. And so the lesson here is that by refusing to accept the shared ancestor hint at face value, by being suspicious about the distance of that relationship, and persisting in our research, we were able to make an interesting discovery. And this may be one that's worthy of publication, so we'll look at that. But going back to this match, based on the amount of shared DNA, Ancestry DNA was predicting that we were third cousins with extremely high confidence, possibly third to fourth cousin range. So there's a discrepancy between what the DNA was saying and what the shared ancestor hint was saying. And of course, I think there are a lot of people who are aware of the fact that when you get a shared ancestor hint, you need to verify the paper trail. I think that's very well known and very well understood. People repeat that often, and they emphasize the fact that shared ancestor hints are, after all, only hints. But when you have these shared ancestor hints juxtaposed with shared DNA, it's very persuasive, and I think sometimes people forget, not only do we need to verify the paper trail, but we need to scrutinize the DNA trail as well. We need to scrutinize that as carefully, and we really need to be sure that we can put the DNA evidence together with the paper trail evidence in a harmonious marriage. So just beware that with shared ancestor hints, Ancestry DNA makes no attempt to reconcile the centimorgan values with the distance of the paper trail relationship. There's really no attempt to make make all of that fit together. And there's no warning that says, hey, this is a seventh cousin once removed relationship, and yet you share too much DNA, so you need to dig deeper. There's really no warning there. You have to think about it yourself. So again, the actual relationship turned out to be fourth cousins. I think this fourth cousin relationship accounts for most, if not all, of the 94 centimorgans of shared DNA. The seventh cousin once removed relationship is probably not contributing any of the shared DNA. And ultimately, this led to a DNA circle connection. Reuben W. Smith was our newly discovered ancestor. A lot of people already had this gentleman in their tree, but the documentation to connect my John Smith to this family was very scarce, and we probably never would have discovered it without the help of DNA evidence. And it was interesting learning about this ancestor. He was definitely a beloved member of his community. And so a very interesting discovery that came about as a result of scrutinizing the DNA evidence as carefully as we scrutinized the paper trail evidence. So that's an important lesson. So moving on to example number 4, this is a shared ancestor hint for my daughter. She has a shared ancestor hint for this colorful fellow, Smith Coffee. He has an interesting history. We have a very good paper trail. The paper trail is essentially impeccable. So we have no doubts about the paper trail on either side of this equation. So JS is my daughter's third cousin 2 times removed. Third cousin 2 times removed. And we have a shared ancestor hint. So that means not only do we share this ancestor, but we also share some DNA, or my daughter does. And we should take a closer look at this before we jump to any conclusions. In this case, the shared amount of shared DNA is 6.5 centimorgans. That's a very weak connection. So we should be aware of that before we start to say that we have a DNA connection to bolster the paper trail. If you click on this link that says, "What does this mean?" you get a description of what does it mean to share 6.5 centimorgans. And the key words here, the key phrase in this case is "you may not be related." Well, the paper trail is good, but I would agree that in this case, the 6.5 centimorgans of DNA doesn't do much to bolster what we know about our family history, and so we should be careful. And in fact, if we compare match lists, we find that JS is not on Mom's match list, as we would expect if this was DNA passed from Smith Coffee to the two cousins in this scenario. In fact, JS doesn't show up on the match lists for either parent. So a lesson in this case, be very careful with low centimorgan matches. You can see this quite frequently, even with shared ancestor hints. So just pay close attention to what's going on with the shared centimorgans. People have said that when you're down near the bottom of the range, for matches at ancestor DNA is 6 centimorgans, we're down close to the bottom of the range. When you're down at the bottom of the range, you're really in a danger zone, and I would agree with that. So just pay close attention. So example number 5 is a shared ancestor hint for my daughter Valentine Montgomery Ules. He was born on 14 February 1849, so apparently his mom was proud and she gave him that name. And now we have a shared ancestor hint for Valentine Montgomery Ules. This is another third cousin twice removed relationship. Let's look at the DNA and see what that tells us about this relationship. In this case, we have a 12 centimorgan relationship, so we would appear to be out of the danger zone. It's still a fairly distant match. We should remember from the table that I put up earlier, as many as 30% of third cousins twice removed would be predicted to share no DNA. So here, maybe we're in the luckier 70%, 12 centimorgans of shared DNA. But again, if we scrutinize this match, even though we're out of what would generally be considered to be the danger zone, this is a match who doesn't match mom or dad. We would want to see this be a match to mom. This is a match through the maternal line in this case with this nameless cousin. But there's no match to either parent. So apparently we're not quite out of the danger zone, and so we should be careful, even when we have a shared ancestor hint, to scrutinize the connections as closely as possible. You don't always have parents tested to do this kind of analysis, but you can check shared match lists and look at it in several different ways and get a sense for whether it's really a good piece of DNA evidence or not. And we could have made this point with the previous example, but I'll say it here. Unfortunately, the lack of maternal DNA does not prevent a maternal hint from showing. So we just have to keep in mind that ancestry DNA doesn't check these connections as rigorously as some people might assume. We have to check these connections ourselves. So to summarize, I'd say that we have 3 important questions to ask about our small segment matches, and we've alluded to these issues already, but I want to state these formally here. First of all, we have to ask whether the match is false. We have to ask whether the match is usable, and we have to ask whether the matching DNA is relevant to any shared ancestry that we've identified. We should be asking these 3 important questions with all of our matches, particularly the small segment matches, and we'll talk about that a little bit more as we go on. So this is a table derived from information on one of the ISOG wiki pages. This is information that came from a process called phasing. And I'd say the take-home point here is that we see fewer problems with larger segments, and we see more problems with smaller segments. And that's the point here. IBS means identical by state, basically means a bad match. IBD means identical by descent. That basically means a good match. So we see with 15 centimorgans, greater than 99% of our matches are good matches. Fewer than 1% of our matches are bad matches at that level. But as we go down, the percentage of good matches goes down, and the percentage of bad matches goes up, and it goes up pretty relentlessly. So with 10 centimorgans, you might say that about 86% are good and about 14% are bad. If you go all the way down to 7 centimorgans, you'll see that most of the matches are not so good. So I certainly don't expect anybody to remember all of these numbers, but the general trend is very important. Small centimorgan matches are very problematic, and you get a lot of bad matches as you go down to the bottom of the pile. So one of the popular ways of exploring the issue of false matches, we've seen this in several blog posts over the past year or so. People have looked at matches not matched to either parent. So they'll look at a child, look at both of the parents, and look at the match lists for the child and both of the parents and see how many discrepancies there are. And with most of the blog posts that I've seen recently regarding match lists at Ancestry DNA, we're seeing that about 30% of a child's matches will not be matched to either parent. So that's a pretty significant percentage, but we can see that as we go to the lower centimorgan matches, the numbers are quite high. So with matches in the 6 to 7 centimorgan range, we'll find that about 65% of the matches for the child are not matched to either parent. So that's a pretty big warning sign that we are in trouble when we're in this category. And things are better in the 7 to 10 centimorgan range, but still a fairly significant rate of matches who are not matched to either parent. At the level greater than 10 centimorgans is looking significantly better, but still 5% at that range will be matches that don't match either parent. And we can debate what this means. There's some subtleties here that we should take into consideration, but I think the basic lesson here is that we have to be careful with the small centimorgan matches. I've looked at this with my own family. Specifically, I've looked at this with my daughter, and I found numbers comparable to what others have found. With Ancestry DNA, I found that 29% of my daughter's matches are not matched to either parent. And at MyHeritage DNA, the number is a little better. 22% of the matches are not matched to either parent. And again, we can debate this a little bit, but fortunately, MyHeritage provides some good details that allow us to dig a little deeper. I won't discuss this in detail right now because we probably don't really have time. You can follow the link to get into the details. But the take-home point from this fairly busy slide is that if we focus on matches who share at least one segment that is at least 10 centimorgans in length, we can probably do a pretty good job of avoiding false matches. So this summarizes that point. Sorting matches at MyHeritage DNA by largest segment to avoid matches who don't share at least one segment that is at least 10 centimorgans in size appears to be a pretty good strategy from what I've seen. This just shows you how you can do that at MyHeritage. You can click on this option and it will sort your matches by largest shared segment. And if you avoid the matches that don't share at least one segment that's at least 10 centimorgans in size, you're doing something that's helpful. And this is another slide that I won't go into in a lot of detail, but this is just to emphasize the fact that some of these apparent false matches may not actually be false matches. We need to think about this carefully. So if you have a match that appears to be a very good match and you have every reason to believe it's a legitimate match, keep in mind that some of these apparent false matches aren't really false positives. They could be false negatives in the other family members. And again, you can follow the link to look at my discussion about that issue. So earlier, we talked about those three questions that I mentioned. Question one, is this a false match? Question two, is this a usable match? Question three, is this a relevant match? This gets to question number two, usable. Is it a usable match? And this is a table from data that Tim Jansen analyzed, and this is from the ISOG wiki page entitled Identical by Descent. And the take-home point from this table is that even if we have gotten around the issue of a potential false positive, we still have to contend with the issue of whether the match is usable. So we may have analyzed a small segment match, and we may have determined that we're very confident that despite the fact that only a small amount of DNA is shared, we're still confident that it's a good match. We still have to contend with the issue of whether it's a match that's going to be useful for us in our family history research, because some of these many of these small centimorgan matches are going to be from shared ancestors who are well beyond the scope of our research and too many generations back to be of any use in our research. So with the 6 centimorgan segments, we may have a shared ancestor within the past 6 generations less than 1% of the time. With 6 to 12 centimorgan segments, we may find a shared ancestor within the past 6 generations about 5% of the time, and so on. 12 to 20 centimorgans, maybe we'll find a shared ancestor within the past 6 generations 20% of the time. So this is yet another reason to be very cautious with these low centimorgan matches. We've got the false positive rate to contend with, and we have the issue of very distant ancestry to contend with. So this is a similar point from a study by Speed and Balding, where they looked at simulated data, and they determined that segments between 20 and 30 megabase pairs have approximately 40% chance of coming from an ancestor greater than 10 generations back. Again, this is based on simulated data, so it's not exactly clear how well this applies to actual empirical information, but it does highlight a problem that we have. And just to let you know, 20 megabase pair segment is approximately 20 centimorgans. So again, we have 2 big problems with small segments, and we probably can't emphasize this enough. We contend with small matches, we contend with false matches, and we contend with remote shared ancestry. So then the question would be, what are we supposed to do about these distant matches? These distant matches often comprise a very large percentage of our match list. And you might say, well, just stick with the top of the match list, but you have new matches coming in all the time. Some of these low centimorgan matches are going to be showing up on your search results. You may be searching for a particular surname, and you'll get a small centimorgan match, and you'll be interested in finding out what's going on there. So these small segment matches are going to come up in your research frequently, but I would say you generally should avoid small segment matches. And my strategy has been to focus on matches who share at least one segment that's at least in the 10 to 15 centimorgan range. You can make exceptions to this on occasion, but I found that if you get down below this, you may or may not be in territory where you're dealing with a lot of false positives, but you're going to have a lot of difficulty finding the shared ancestor if you don't at least have one segment that is at least 10 to 15 centimorgans in size. And I've through the years, I've gotten to the point where I almost always look for matches that share at least one segment that's at least 15 centimorgans in length. So the other strategy to deal with small centimorgan matches and to contend with this issue is to test as many family members as possible. And we've kind of alluded to that strategy with some of the prior examples. You might share only 6 centimorgans with a match, and you'll compare with another family member, might be a sibling, it might be a parent, and find that the other family member shares 40 centimorgans, and then, or 60 centimorgans, and then the question of whether it's a good match or not suddenly becomes much more clear. So that's another strategy. Yet another strategy I didn't list here, I should have listed. You can compare at GEDmatch or MyHeritage. Get a second opinion if you have a small segment match and you think it might actually be a good match. You might be right, and comparison at another database might make things more clear. So that's another important strategy. But when you're at GEDmatch, whatever you do, don't lower the minimum segment centimorgan size. There are a lot of people out there who are lowering the match threshold all the way down to 1 centimorgan. And hopefully from the information that I've presented tonight, you can see that that's a really big mistake. But a lot of people are doing that. So we have to get away from doing that, forcing a match to show up by adjusting the centimorgan threshold down to ridiculously low numbers. It's going to send you down some rabbit holes. It's not good research. It's a waste of resources. So don't get caught up in that mistake. A couple of other strategies. You can consider triangulation. Jim Bartlett's written a lot about triangulation, and in particular he's written about how triangulation can shed light on small segments, so you might consider that as well. And I've written a post on the role of visual phasing in illuminating small segments. I don't want to push the envelope on this issue. There are enough people already pushing the envelope way too far. But if you look at triangulation and you look at visual phasing, sometimes you could get some interesting insights about small segments. So you can follow the links to those blog posts if you're interested. So again, after I've said all this about avoiding small segment matches, here to tell you as well that rules are meant to be broken, and here's a good example of that. L. Lee is an elderly gentleman, but he's in a lot of the DNA databases. He's a very active researcher, so it's good to have him as a cousin. Initially, I overlooked this match, and you'll see why with these numbers here on this slide. At MyHeritage, he is shown as sharing 14.6 centimorgans with me, and our largest shared segment is 8.6 centimorgans in length. So by the rules that I've told you earlier, this is somebody you probably want to ignore. At Ancestry DNA, he's shown as sharing 10.7 centimorgans on just one segment. And at 23andMe, he is shown as sharing a 12 centimorgan segment with me on chromosome 7 and 2 other segments that are much smaller. And so you can see why I overlooked this match for quite a while. This is a very unimpressive, weak match. And yet, he is a perfect Y-DNA match to me at Family Tree DNA. And so, because of that, I did eventually take a look at the autosomal connections and found that he is a first cousin to 2 of my top autosomal matches for my direct paternal line. He shares the expected amount of DNA with those first cousins of his. And both of those first cousins share quite a bit of DNA with me and my family, about 100 centimorgans with various members of my family. So I looked a little closer and found that the autosomal DNA that he shares with my family triangulates to our direct paternal line, and we are actually third cousins once removed. So you have to be flexible with the rules. This was not a very good match. I didn't have any reason to believe that I should be paying attention to it. Wasn't linked to Family Tree. It just didn't look very good at all, and yet it turned out to be a good match. So keep an open mind, be flexible. any rule is going to come with trade-offs. If you say, okay, well, I'm going to go ahead and look at matches that go all the way down to 10 centimorgans, you're going to be wading through a lot of bad matches, or matches that may be good in some sense, but far too distant to trace back to a common ancestor. If you raise that threshold to 15 centimorgans, you're going to deal with fewer bad matches, but you're going to miss a few good ones. So there's a trade-off. You could pick 12 centimorgans, and still there's going to be a trade-off. So there's no perfect threshold, but I would say never say never say always, never say impossible. Eventually you're going to run into an example that defies all of the rules. So with that, I'll say thank you. It's a privilege to be able to speak with you about these issues. I really appreciate your time and attention, and I would ask you to like, share, send by email, send to your friends, post on your Facebook page if you like this post. It will be available on YouTube as well. So please like, share, and subscribe if you like this video. And at this point, we can proceed